In this slidecast, we're going to look at the cost structure. These are all the costs that you have in your business model. It's basically an outcome of the backstage of your business model. So what really is a cost structure? It's all costs incurred from operating your business model. It's the outcomes of the choices you make in the backstage of your business model. And of course, your costs should always be smaller than your revenues. Otherwise, you don't have a very sustainable business model. There are two main categories of costs: fixed costs and variable costs. Let's start by looking at fixed costs. And we'll start with a definition. Fixed costs are independent of the volume of goods and services that you produce. Examples include salaries, rents, production facilities. Now, some types of businesses have much higher fixed costs than others. And a great example here is the pharmaceutical industry. Let's look at this on the business model canvas. So in a pharmaceutical company, you will have a lot of research and development, very, very high costs, and you probably have a sales force distributing the inventions that you have, so high sales and marketing costs. These are both fixed costs, and they're usually very high in a pharmaceutical company. On the other hand, the manufacturing of the drugs usually isn't very high. These are variable costs, and they can be very, very cheap. So the main costs of a pharmaceutical company are usually the fixed costs. Let's look at variable costs. Now, variable costs really depend on the volume of goods and services that you produce and that you sell. So some types of businesses have higher variable costs than fixed costs. And a great example here is the retail business. How does this look on the business model canvas? Of course, you will have fixed costs in a retail business. For example, you need a network of stores. If you're not selling through the internet, that will be a fixed cost. And you will have sales and marketing, usually very high. But the variable costs are higher than these fixed costs. And in the variable costs, you'll have purchasing of the goods from your partners. The cost of goods sold is usually very high. So the proportion of variable costs in retail is often much, much higher than the fixed costs. Now, an interesting question is, can fixed costs sometimes become variable costs and vice versa? Let's look at an example. Let's look at Bharti Airtel. Bharti Airtel is one of the biggest mobile phone companies in the world based in India, and they offer mobile phone services. So they will have designing and building the network as a key activity, network infrastructure, very, very high fixed costs. And the same for IT, very, very high fixed costs. Now, this is driven by the backstage, and it requires high capital expenditures. So Bharti asks, well, what if we didn't own these? Maybe we could change our fixed costs. And that's exactly what they did. They outsourced the network infrastructure and the IT infrastructure to a consortium. They signed vendor contracts, which would then allow them to offer mobile phone services. So the costs in the backstage would become pure variable costs. They would only pay for the mobile phone services that they offer to their customers. Very interesting shift from fixed costs to variable costs, and it changed the way Bharti Airtel could do business. There are two types of business models: cost-driven models and value-driven models. And we'll start with cost-driven business models. So cost-driven means that there's really a focus on minimizing all the costs wherever possible. And it usually means that you're competing on price. That's why you need to drive the costs down. A great example here is low-cost carriers. They do everything in their business model to keep the costs low. So in the business model canvas, a big focus will be on the backstage to drive down the costs so they can compete on price. Now, cost advantages might also come from other places, for example, economies of scale or economies of scope. So what are economies of scale? Let's look at a definition. It's cost advantages that increase with your size. And it means that the average cost per unit fall as the output rises. So the more you produce, the cheaper it gets for you to produce. Now, an example here is Costco Wholesale, one of the biggest retailers in the world. They're so big that when they do purchasing, They obviously have a very, very strong purchasing power and they can drive down the prices. So what about economies of scope? Economies of scope are slightly different. It means that you get cost advantages because you're doing a lot of different things. So certain business model components, if you want, can help support different value propositions and different customer segments. So an example here would be the Nestle products that are based on pods, on capsules. So you'll have a whole range of machines that produce pods, and as a company, Nestle can create synergies between these very different businesses. Now let's look at value-driven business models where costs are not as important. So value-driven means that you're usually less concerned with the cost because you're focusing on the higher end. You're focusing on creating value. So what you really are looking at is creating premium value propositions. So a typical example here is the high-end luxury hotels. And in fact, because they're so value-focused, it could be very bad to focus on cost because it might decrease the premium value that you're creating. So make sure that you understand what drives the cost of your business model and understand if you should be cost-driven or value-driven. Class dismissed.